Hey Tribal fam, it's Nikachu, and today let's talk about tribal decks and what they need to compete. A lot of people ask me, hey Nikachu, what does Faeries need to be competitive in Modern? What is Vampires missing to be a competitive deck? So today I'd love to give my thoughts on it since I am a Merfolk master. I've played Merfolk competitively for the last 7 years. I have some idea of what it takes to be viable for a tribal deck to be playable at a competitive level. But before we start, please check if you have subscribed. YouTube loves notifying you of my videos and you keep watching them. My channel is blowing up, but my subscriber ratio keeps shrinking. It's free to subscribe, so just click it from red to gray. So we'll go over the most popular tribes and see what they're missing. But before we do that, we've got to go over the cards that are oppressing the tribal decks. Let's start with Plague Engineer. This is an absolutely fucked card. You know, it came out in Modern Horizons, which was quoted as a tribal set. They were going to help boost the tribal decks. They gave goodies to Goblins, they gave goodies to Slivers, but what's the point of it if this card not only wipes them all away, but also just crushes any and all tribal decks in the format? Look at this thing. 3 mana for Engineered Plague on a creature, 2/2 with Death Touch. Was that really necessary? So, I mean, it can wipe out all the 1 toughness creatures and is a huge barrier for all tribal decks to even be competitive, because so long as cards like Plague Engineer exist, all the 1 toughness creatures are useless. They're like complete garbage. And even then, Plague Engineer doesn't even need to be played against tribal decks. It just needs to be played against 1 toughness creatures. So I mean, if there are a bunch of humans or spirits or some other creature type with 1 toughness, this Plague Engineer says, enters the battlefield, destroy target creature and all future creatures with 1 toughness of that creature type. And I have this amazing blocker, because if you dare attack me, I'm just going to trade with it. So anyway, Plague Engineer was an absolute mistake. If Wizards of the Coast gives even the slightest shit about the tribal decks, about the tribal community in Magic the Gathering, they will ban this card. I'm serious. They banned Birthing Pod because this was oppressing other creature-based decks. And what do you think Plague Engineer does? It completely suppresses all tribal strategies because most of them have 1 toughness creatures. How do they survive? If your deck doesn't have a sufficient number of lords or 2 toughness creatures, I mean, there's just no way of beating this. And it can be slotted into any deck. It's only a single black. Basically, any deck that's splashing even the slightest amount of black can run this card. The next offender is Walking Ballista. This card not only is good very early on in the game, but also very good in the late portion of the game. So it can be a chump blocker early while sniping off a 1 toughness creature, or it's like a giant win condition later on in the game when the opponent has a lot of mana. I mean, the problem is that it, again, snipes off all the 1 toughness creatures that we do see in tribal decks. Next, Wrenn and 6. Well, that's great. By turn 2, you're sniping down the mana creatures, you're sniping down my 1-drop, my 2-drop. That's what Wrenn and 6 does. So what you end up doing is you force the tribal decks to play with a lot less 1 toughness creatures, which then makes it way harder to design your deck in the first place. And lastly, Lava Dart. Okay, shoot this and shoot another thing for free. That is just wonderful. Lava Dart is a staple in the prowess decks and is just an incredibly good piece of interaction because it basically just costs 1 mana, because the second half of it can be played without paying any mana. So I bring all those cards up because that's the barrier to entry for the tribal decks. When you're building a tribal deck, you have to be keeping all those things in mind, and if you can't compete with any of those cards, which are very popular in Modern, your deck's going to suffer. It's going to struggle, because at one point or another you're going to be playing against them and it can completely wipe you out. The poor Spirits players, they could spend 4 mana to get Rattle Chains and Selfless Spirit on the battlefield just to get undermined by a single Lava Dart. So before we go into the tribes, I just want to address a few things. First off, every tribe should basically have access to a turn 4 kill in some way. There could be some exceptions if the deck wants to play a more controlling role or is a bit too clunky, but for in general, I mean, you got to have at least some sort of proactive plan to put pressure on the opponent, get them to react to you, because otherwise you're just going to constantly be reacting to your opponents. Most decks can win by turn 3, turn 4 in Modern, and you should at least have your own game plan to win within a reasonable amount of time. Second thing, tribal decks should in some way be able to protect themselves or have some plan when they are constantly being bombarded by removal. Modern is a very heavy removal format, so just be prepared when your opponent is just chucking tons of removal spells at your creatures. And lastly, I think every tribal deck to some degree should have some interaction for their opponents. If you can't interact, then you're probably just going to get goldfished and raced by too many modern decks. So let's start off with humans and spirits, and they both have one thing in common. They're great. They're actually really good complete decks at the moment. I don't think they need any more cards. So I mean, humans has a super proactive game plan between Champion of the Parish or even Noble Hierarch into like Mantis Rider. They have Thales Lieutenant to push a lot of damage, Phantasmal Image to copy it. They have great interaction, Kite Sail Freebooter, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, Meddling Mage, and also Reflector Mage to interact with their opponent's creatures. And if you go with spirits, they have good aggression as well. They have cards like Mausoleum Wanderer, also good interaction with Spell Queller, exiling spells with converted mana cost 4 or less. They have enough lords between Drog Skull Captain and Supreme Phantom. And they can protect their creatures with like Rattle Chains and Selfless Spirits. So they are doing great. Humans and spirits probably are the two most complete tribal decks in Modern right now. And the only thing that will help them, and they could use the help, is that Wizards ban some of these cards. You ban Plague Engineer, you're going to help the tribal deck. If Prowess disappears from the metagame, we're probably going to see Lava Dart disappear from the metagame. But the thing that's going to bring some of these tribal decks back, even though they are so complete, they've got everything, so many goods, you got to get rid of the oppression of Plague Engineer makes it very difficult. Next, let's go to Merfolk. And I'm bringing up Merfolk early because it's going to prove a point that applies to all the other tribal decks, and that it needs a strong 1-drop. Merfolk has very poor 1-drop creatures for dealing damage, not to mention like their 1/1s, 1/1. This is like a situational 2/2, and why is it off color? That doesn't make any sense. Command Speaker gets +1/+1 as long as you control another Merfolk or an island. That's really pathetic for a 1-drop. Like when you compare that to like Champion of the Parish or Mausoleum Wanderer or Death Shadow Soulscar Mage, Monastery Swiftspear, like every deck in Modern is a deck generally because they do have some super powerful 1-drop, because you need to start getting the game going by turn 1. And if I have a handful of 2-drops and some lands, like if I'm on the draw, my opponent plays, I don't know, something, I take my turn, I play land pass, I could be just dead lost from there. The tempo loss is backbreaking. So if Wizards wanted to support tribal decks, they need to give a very interactive or very powerful 1-drop to every single tribe. If your tribe is missing something to do on turn 1, let us all know in the comment section below. So let's move on to Faeries. And Faeries community, I feel so sorry for you all. You barely get any playables, and then even when Wizards tried to, with Throne of Eldraine, it didn't really matter. The quintessential problem of the Faeries archetype is that it's just loaded with 1 toughness creatures. I mean, Spellstutter Sprite, Brazen Borrower, new addition to the deck, but still 1 toughness, Vendilion Click. So this deck gets completely dismantled by the staple hoser cards of the format. They just absolutely can't compete. So what can Wizards do to help the Faeries community? And that one of 2 things: start printing more Faeries with 2 toughness, or print more lords for the Faeries. At the moment, there's only 1 dedicated lord to the Faeries, and that is Scion of Una. Not a bad card, not too bad of a card. Other Faeries you control get +1/+1. Other Faeries you control have Shroud, so if you can copy this thing, your whole board is indestructible. But the problem is, this card is also very vulnerable. Only a 1 toughness creature by itself. It's not going to survive a Plague Engineer, so you need to have more than 1 lord in order to protect the Scion of Una to protect the rest of the team. Faeries needs at least a 2-mana lord and at least some 2 toughness creatures to keep up with the removal of Modern. Alright, moving on to Slivers. Everybody loves Slivers. Look at this. Sinew Sliver, Predatory Sliver, and they got some love in Modern Horizons with Cloud Shredder Sliver. I think this card is very powerful because it gives the Slivers evasion very quickly and haste, so all future Slivers that are coming out on turn 3 and 4 can help clock the opponent for a turn 4 kill. But there's a problem. Most Sliver decks are designed like just some sort of aggro deck trying to clock the opponent by turn 4. And that's not too bad, but the problem is they've got no defense versus removal spells. And I think one card that can really put Slivers over the top is Crystalline Sliver. So if they printed this into Modern, this is an actual Magic card. It's Legacy playable, but it's not Modern playable. For a blue and a white, all Slivers have Shroud. So that will give Slivers the protection that they need against the wide array of removal spells that Modern has to attack tribal decks. So moving on to Goblins, they have a very interesting archetype already because they can combo off with Conspicuous Snoop into Bogart Harbinger, which will put a creature on top of their library, which will be Kiki Jiki. Conspicuous Snoop then copies the ability of Kiki Jiki, making infinite copies of itself, but then eventually copying a Bogart Harbinger again to go get Siege Gang Lieutenant, which can sacrifice the whole board to deal infinite damage. They even have like some really good proactive cards like Munitions Expert to interact with the opponent's creatures and Planeswalkers. But as many other tribal decks, they have so many 1 toughness creatures, and they are going to have an incredibly hard time trying to compete with, you know, Plague Engineer, Lava Dart, Ren and 6, and Walking Ballista. But I think that's going to be a cost for having a tribal deck that can just combo kill you out of nowhere. So how can we improve this deck? I think it could use one more 1-drop. Yes, they have Skirk Prospector, but that might not be enough. I don't know if Goblin Lackey is too much for Modern because you get to attack, put a goblin directly onto the battlefield. That seems pretty busted. However, they need something on turn 1. They don't have enough playables to help back up their Munitions Expert to make them a much more proactive deck. So Elves is an interesting deck that actually has won GPs in the past. The deal is that they are pretty much exclusively a creature combo deck by trying to amass enough elves on the battlefield. Then when you have enough elves, you can create enough mana and then sink that into some sort of payoff. Like, for example, Elvish Warmaster, which just came out in Kaldheim. It's a 2/2 elf warrior. You get some value whenever you put some elves on the battlefield, but the real payoff is for 7 mana, elves you control get +2/+2 and gain Death Touch until end of turn. And if you have some insane amount of mana, you just sink it all into the Elvish Warmaster and attack your opponent for the kill. But the main problem with elves, and it's been like that for forever, is that they need to amass enough elves on the battlefield. Very difficult in a format with so much removal. So difficult with hate cards like Plague Engineer. So the deal is, I think what elves needs more than anything is they need some source of card advantage in the face of the removal. I'm not saying Glimpse of Nature or anything like that, but you know what? Something like Shaper Sanctuary is very good. It's very strong, but it's an enchantment. You can't find this with Court of Calling or Collected Company, but what if it was in the form of a creature? What if it was a Shaper Sanctuary on top of a 1-drop to help keep the gas flowing, give elves a fighting chance versus the decks that are just pouring tons of removal spells against them? Let's take a look at Dwarves. Dwarves actually has some really cool, great cards. Look at Toolcraft Exemplar. 1 mana for basically a 3/2 creature. Because at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control an artifact, Toolcraft Exemplar gets +2/+1 until end of turn. But also if you control 3 or more artifacts, you know, it also gains First Strike until end of turn. Not a bad deal. And we look at Magda. Magda is actually quite busted. A 2-mana Lord. 2/1 creature. Other dwarves you control get +1/+0. And whenever a dwarf you control becomes tapped, create a treasure token. That's just free mana as far as I'm concerned. Sacrifice 5 treasure, search your library for an artifact or dragon card. It can be an artifact. Put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So a tutor for a potentially busted card. Maybe a Blightsteel Colossus, for example. And then we have Depala, which is also such gas. A red, white, and 1 generic for a 3/3 creature that is a lord, +1/+1 to all other dwarves you control. Each vehicle you control gets +1/+1 as long as it's a creature. But get this, whenever Depala Pilot Exemplar becomes tapped, you may pay X, and if you do, reveal the top X cards of your library, put all dwarf and vehicle cards from among them into your hand, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Wow, you can refill your hand with this thing? But here's the problem. Exactly what is in your deck to refill your hand with? I think these 3 dwarves are all that the dwarf tribe has. So my request from Wizards of the Coast is print more dwarves. This is like a really old tribe, and it just doesn't have enough playables to even be a deck. It only has basically 3 creatures, and then maybe you can add, I don't know, 3 smugglers, copters, and a few Heart of Kirins in the mix. It's just not enough. Now let's take a look at zombies. I think a very underrated tribe in the modern metagame, because a lot of decks have a lot of trouble against removal spells, but if there's one tribe that doesn't, it's zombies. They are insanely resistant to the removal spells. Just take a look at this. Gravecrawler, 2/1 creature. Oh, you want to kill this thing? Well, I'll just play another zombie later and then cast Gravecrawler from my graveyard. How convenient is that? And then you look at Carrion Feeder. It can get bigger to get out of range of Lava Dart of Plague Engineer by sacrificing creatures to it. You can have a very large Carrion Feeder. Geralf's Messenger. Oh, you want to kill this thing? Well, guess what? It's going to come back larger than ever before and has an ETB trigger of you losing 2 life. When it comes into play, you lose 2 life. You want to kill it, comes back, you lose another 2 life. So really good clock, really resistant to all the removal. Even Undead Augur is a form of card advantage. Whenever Undead Augur or another zombie you control dies, which you have some control over because of Carrion Feeder, you need some cards, just sacrifice your Gravecrawler over and over again. Sack Gravecrawler, lose life, draw a card, bring it back from the graveyard, sack it again to the Carrion Feeder, draw as many cards as you feel that you need. So zombies incredibly good at grinding out the removal in Modern, but there are some weaknesses. First off, they're not very good at blocking, so if there is another aggro deck, they can just speed right past zombies and they will have no problem. Gravecrawler cannot block, Carrion Feeder cannot block, Geralf's Messenger in theory can block, but comes into the battlefield tapped, and so basically isn't ready to block even by turn 3, which is a very sensitive turn in Modern. Also very interesting, there is, if you look up all the playable zombies, there's tons of stuff at 1 mana, tons of stuff at 3 mana, not so much at 2 mana. The Undead Augur is the only playable 2 mana zombie that basically exists. Given that this came out of Modern Horizons, Wizards R&D might have recognized, oh, we have like no zombies at 2 CMC. So the point is, the curve for zombies is a little wonky, and I think that you could help zombies big time by giving them some sort of good interaction on a body. So they printed Murderous Rider, and this definitely is something that is in the range of what zombies is looking for, you know, interaction while on a creature, but the problem is it was at 3 mana, and if they had some sort of effect like this at 2 mana, I think that could go a really long way for the zombie players, so they don't get overrun by a competing creature decks. And then we get to vampires, and as far as I'm concerned, Vampires has almost everything. I just don't know if enough people have investigated Vampires as a competitive tribe in Modern. I mean, they've got a very strong 1-drop here, Knight of the Ebon Legion, 1/2 creature, so it doesn't have the problem of getting eaten up by Plague Engineer, Ren and 6, Lava Dart, Walking Ballista. So they have lords like Legion Lieutenant, 2/2 creature, other vampires you control get +1/+1. They have these amazing death triggers. Cordial Vampire, I think, is one of the most underrated cards, especially for this tribe. Whenever Cordial Vampire or another creature dies, another creature, any creature, could be your opponent's creatures as you kill them, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. This card is, the card is like super OP, very underrated. If Vampires gets busted one day, this is gonna have a huge contribution to it. Now, one problem I do see with the Vampire tribe is that it gets most of its abilities from their creatures dying. So we have stuff like Calastria Highborn. Whenever Highborn or another vampire you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you can pay a black. If you do, target player loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. That's not too bad, except that ties up your mana quite a bit. When you're playing a tribal deck, you're generally tapping out over and over and over again. You may not have enough mana to make use of Calastria Highborn. And when I look at the vampires, they don't have many good ETB effects. Like spirits, humans, they've got really good ETBs. Enter the battlefield, get value. But vampires is more like ETB get nothing, but when they die, they get some value. So if wizards could give vampires some ETB creatures, that could help push it over the top. But really, vampires, super underrated. Just look at Sorin, Imperious Bloodlord. This is show and tell. Black 2 generic. Look at the -3. You may put a vampire creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. Alright, so the day that they print some OP vampire, you better believe this is going to see play. Another thing wizards could do is bring back tribal cards for instant sorceries and enchantments. Particularly give a bonus to the tribe that's playing them. That way you can push certain effects to help a tribe that isn't going to be abused by other archetypes. So what do you guys think of my suggestions? If you play a tribal deck, let me know which one it is in the description below, and let me know what upgrades you think it needs to become a more competitive deck. So if you like this video, don't forget to smash that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel, or wizards will print Plague Master -2/-2 to everything.